So I'd like to start by expressing my own gratitude to my teacher. We've got a picture of him here, Ogyen Sangrachta, and also a brother in the order, Akupa, who lives in Newcastle, for giving me the inspiration for this talk. And also I'd like to thank Ed for willing to be the reader. We're going to hear the Buddha's words and some words of Sangrachta. So the world is burning. The world is burning. The problems we face in the world are shocking and terrible. We've got war in Europe for the first time in many years, decades, injustice, prejudice, poverty and inequality, destruction and contamination of our environment, and obviously, that's most obvious of all, climate change. Here in Spain, sometimes the world is literally burning. You know, there were big fires in the south of Spain recently, and the temperature's rising. So, why is this happening? It's a very complex situation, isn't it? We know there are many complex reasons and causes. We have overpopulation, consumerism, technological development that runs wild without restraint. And of course, capitalist economics, exploitation of people and resources by multinational corporations who aren't accountable to anyone. And then there are the other forces of nationalism, racism, sexism, the list goes on. And these are the extrinsic reasons, the external reasons for why our world is burning and why we need a light in these dark times. But the Buddha also noticed and noted that the world was burning 2,500 years ago. And as always, the Buddha had a very distinctive and perspicacious, a very clear-seeing view on the reason for this. So I'm going to ask Ed to read our first reading, which is from the Buddha. It's called the Fire Sermon, although that's not what the Buddhists call it when it came to the West. But it's a very famous reading.
Bhikkhus, all is burning. And what is all that is burning? The I is burning. Visible forms are burning. I consciousness is burning. I contact is burning. Also feeling, whether pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that arises with eye contact as its condition, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. It is burning with birth, aging and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair, I say. The ear is burning, sounds are burning, the nose is burning, odours are burning, the tongue is burning, flavours are burning, the body is burning, tangibles are burning, the mind is burning, mental objects are burning, mind consciousness is burning, mind contact is burning. Also the feeling, whether pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that arises with mind contact as its condition, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. It is burning with birth, aging and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair, I say.
They're strong words. And he gave them to a bunch of his followers who were actually fire worshippers. The Vedic tradition of the sacred fire, and so for them it would have been even more impactful using that image. And they've resonated down through the ages because in a way all human societies have this problem. And so here we begin to see the intrinsic reasons for why the world is burning, why our world is burning. And the Buddha's pointing to the fact that the greed, the hatred and the ignorance, the willful ignorance, the delusion, what we could say broadly the label of all forms of selfishness and its many forms, this is the reason that the extrinsic reasons come about. So of course it's vital to address the extrinsic, the external reasons, you know, the degradation of the climate and and the society, poverty and so on. But we also absolutely have to address the intrinsic reasons. Otherwise, any advance in social change will get corrupted by the selfish forces of greed, hatred and delusion. History gives us untold examples of movements of social change that started with very noble ideals and ended with terrible atrocities. We only need to look at the 20th century, the noble ideals of some of the socialist, communist movements and the horrible atrocities that they perpetrated. So without addressing the intrinsic reasons, there won't be real change and we won't solve these problems. So, to put it another way, in order to transform the world, we also have to transform the individual. You can't achieve the one without the other. And in this sense, the Dharma is absolutely clear, absolutely radical, absolutely pragmatic. The Buddha's teaching says you cannot achieve lasting growth and change without addressing both together. It doesn't work. It's like a bird that only has one wing. You need two wings to fly. So we have to change self and the world together. Of course, that can be a bit overwhelming. Just changing one of those things can seem like it's too much. How can we contemplate doing both together? And in order to understand this, that's the theme I want to go into in this talk, we have to look at more deeply at who we think we are, what we think we are. So look at the stories that we tell ourselves about who and what we are. We all tell ourselves stories all the time about who we are, what we are. And these stories define how we are going to act in the world. In order to have a creative response to the world's problems, we need to become conscious of what stories are being told by ourselves and others around us, and to ascertain, to find out, are they actually true and are they actually helpful at this moment in our history? So I'm going to give you two stories. I'm going to compare them and we'll see how that sits with you. So the dominant public discourse, and it has been for some hundreds of years, is the materialist story. And I'm just going to sum it up very briefly. Yeah? So this is a story, and if you're a materialist, this is what you'd be telling yourself. So I'm a collection of atoms, and atoms are made of dead matter. And within my body is an organ, which is called the brain, which in some mysterious way, which science hasn't been able to explain, creates my consciousness. It seems that I and all living beings are an improbable accident of the material universe, and that my consciousness is merely a byproduct of this. My particular life has no profound meaning apart from the propagation of my DNA. Therefore, the highest I can hope to achieve in this life is to dominate my environment, control my experiences so that they're mostly pleasurable, and propagate my DNA. So I've dumbed it down a bit, okay? But essentially, this is what the materialist story is saying. And most of us have grown up with this story. It was bred into us with our mother's milk, as it were. And we take it as the literal truth, unthinkingly. But it's important, it's crucial to us, this is a story. It's a metaphysical belief. It's not proven anywhere. It's not scientifically proven. It's just taken as a starting assumption. Now, this story has some problems. I think, just the way I put it, you can see there are some problems. But I'll just highlight briefly, and this is a whole philosophical discussion if you want to have it, but you can do that in the tea break. But it has some tendencies which are very destructive. So one is the exploitation of the environment and other living beings, because it's all there, it's all made out of this dead matter, and it's all there for me to use as I want. Another implication is that you only empathise with a limited group of people, those that help propagate your DNA, your family, your relations, maybe your town, or you're only empathising with those that help. And another implication of this story, if you deeply believe it, is that everything is subordinated to satisfying the desires of the self. So we can see that some of its consequences are very poor, and they damage both the individual and the benefit of the individual, growth and the world. So I'm going to contrast this with the story that the Buddha tells us about who we deeply are. And I'm going to ask Ed to read the very short passage from the Pabhasara Sutta about the luminous mind.
Luminous, bhikkhus, is this mind, but it is defiled by adventitious defilements. The uninstructed worldling does not understand this as it really is. Therefore I say that for the uninstructed worldling there is no development of mind. Luminous, bhikkhus, is this mind, and it is freed from adventitious defilements. The instructed noble disciple understands this as it really is. Therefore I say that for the instructed noble disciple there is development of the mind.
So if we take the Buddha's vision of what a human being is seriously, that the fundamental base of our mind is luminous consciousness, then what follows from that? Well, it's a metaphor, obviously, the metaphor of light. Light is radiant, it expands and it warms. So the nature of mind is clear, expansive and warm. And that warmth is an indication of the meditation that we just did, the metta bhavana, loving kindness. And also light expands without limits. It expands into space on and on. You know, we've got the James Webb Space Telescope. They're looking at light from 13 billion years ago, light years across space. There are no limits. So again, the image tells us that we're not limited. You know, the luminous mind is not limited. Light beams cross and interpenetrate without obstruction. We're indivisible parts of the universe affecting each other, this flow and interchange of light. And everything we do, whether it's for good or for ill, ripples out into the universe. So it makes a difference what you do with this luminous mind. Light is knowing. It's like it illuminates a particular form. It sees, and when there's light, you can identify what it is. So it's recognition. It's sort of knowledge in a way. And also there's beauty. If you imagine looking at a sunset or the full moon rising over the beach in Barcelona, or a landscape or a painting, how we perceive beauty, one of the crucial forms is through light. So light and beauty are very interchangeable in some way. When light comes, there's a sense of beauty. So this is what the Buddha, his version of what we really are, is that we're more like this. And of course, you know, which story you're going to choose. I know which one I've chosen, but think carefully about which story you identify with. Now, a surprising consequence of this story that the Buddha offers is that this light is not personal. It's not personal. This luminous mind illuminates and warms the world, and it's present in all living beings to some extent. And the function of the Buddha's teaching, the Dharma, is to eliminate what in the text it calls the adventitious defilements, so that they don't obstruct the shining forth of the clarity, the kindness, and the freedom. In other words, the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, invites us to become individuals, real individuals, who can share and manifest our part of this light. So then the question arises, how do you become an individual, a real individual, someone who's able to manifest and share that portion of light in the world? Well, the first and perhaps most important step is to realise that your actions do have consequences, and that the consequences are concordant with the nature of the action. So I'm going to ask Ed to read the next from the Dhammapada, the first two verses of the Dhammapada, which is one of the most famous Buddhist texts that speak about this.
Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs.
Maybe read that again, Ed. It's such an important text.
Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs.
So these very famous verses summarize the law of karma, which it can sound a bit mystical, but it's in a way it's quite simple. Our actions have consequences, and the consequences of our actions correspond to the ethical quality of the action. So this law of karma is like a natural law, like the law of gravity. It applies wherever there is consciousness and will. In order to grow spiritually, in order to grow as individuals, we need to act in accordance with this universal law. That means take responsibility for the consequences of our actions and create ourselves in terms of positive habits that align ourselves with the nature of the universe. There's a little passage from Sangharakshita about taking responsibility that I'm going to ask Ed to read now.
To act without thinking of the consequences of one's actions is irresponsibility. To act bearing in mind the consequences of one's actions is responsibility. To the extent that one acts responsibly, one is an individual. To the extent that one acts without responsibility, one is not an individual. So, if one wants to become an individual, one must learn to act responsibly.
Very simple to say, not so simple to do. And that's why we have the Dharma, that's why we have the teaching. And the first two steps, in terms of we're moving now towards how do you transform self and world together, are what in the Buddhist tradition are called Dharma and Sila, generosity and ethics. They're the first two perfections in the path of the Bodhisattva, the Buddhist who transforms himself or herself for the benefit of all beings. Now I'll just mention them briefly because they're so important, they're spoken about so widely, there are talks and books, but I'll mention them now. This is the starting point of transforming self and world. So Dhamma, giving, generosity, is the emblematic Buddhist quality. It's the basis of the whole path, really. It's that fundamental turn away from what you can get to what you can give. And without that, there's no path, there's no growth. We remain trapped in the little bubble of our own self and its problems and, my issues and so on. It's like being a rat in a trap, caught in a trap. You can't get out, because you're just concerned with this little bubble. When you make that turn, you think, well, what can I give? It's that first movement away into something bigger, into a greater freedom. And the Buddhist tradition, as I say, values this very highly. There's a huge amount one could say. I'm just going to give one traditional list. What can we give? So we can give material things and money, of course. And the centre needs lots of money if you want to give it. Material things. We can give time and energy. Yeah, so give your time and energy to others and causes that are valuable. Then there's courage. There's a lot of emphasis, a lot of value in the Buddhist tradition, giving courage, fearlessness, giving education, and of course there's giving life and limb. Some of the most inspiring examples in our history are people who've given life and limb for others. Then the Dharma also talks about giving merits. We do all this practice and we become nicer people and so on, but you have to give that away too, not hold on to it in a way that makes it tight and it's my spiritual attainment. And last of all, giving the Dharma, giving the truth, giving the tools so that living beings can liberate themselves. These are all things we can give. And then Sila, which translates as ethics. So, as we've seen, the Buddha's vision of who we deeply are, our actions inevitably flow outwards, perfuming the world. And of course, perfume is a bit of, it sort of depends. If you act unskillfully, your actions are like a bad stink. and people want to get away, you know. If you act skillfully with positive ethical attention and intelligence, then your actions are like a sweet fragrance, which it says they even flow against the wind, and people will be attracted to that. So everything you do, we have to discern, you know, am I acting from the basis of hatred and greed and my delusion, or am I acting from generosity, love and clarity? And once we start to become individuals, we begin to notice our effect on the world more and take responsibility for that. And therefore we try and live in accordance with the ethical precepts. There are traditionally 5 practiced by Buddhists all over the world. And they're really elaborations of the principle of non-violence, not doing any violence in the world. And fundamentally, you could say these precepts are how to live well, how to live in harmony with others, how to live in harmony with reality. In the long run, this is the way to happiness and to freedom. If we don't align ourselves with this natural law of actions and consequences, we won't be happy and we won't be free. So we're beginning to see how the transformation of self and world interact. As we become truer individuals, we're more sensitive to others and the suffering in the world, and that will affect us more. We can't really ignore the conflagration, the burning that's going on. And that throws up in your face as a Buddhist, well, what am I doing about that, you know? One of our great teachers in the Tibetan tradition is Subhuti, and he has a little phrase about this, which I like. He says, the only way to bear the suffering of the world is to be involved in ending it. The only way to bear the suffering of the world is to be involved in ending it. So the question I want to turn to now is, do Buddhists have a political agenda? Do Buddhists have a political agenda? Many people think that because Buddhists are concerned with meditative and transcendental experiences, that therefore they don't have a political agenda. This isn't really correct. It's precisely because we Buddhists are concerned with meditative and transcendental experiences that we have a very radical political agenda. A very radical political agenda. And I'd say, well, one can debate this, but I'd say there are 3 fundamental elements to the Buddhist political agenda. So the first element is that unconditional love is the only way out. Unconditional love is the only way out. And there's again in that famous text, the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, the 5th verse of this text, which is several hundred verses long, so it's right at the beginning, he says, not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. And I'm now going to ask Ed to read one of the Buddha's emblematic discourses on love, universal love. It's called the Karaniya Metta Sutta. This is just an extract from that sutta.
May all beings be happy and secure. May they be inwardly happy. Whatever living beings there are, whether frail or firm, those that are large, middling, short, fine or gross, whether they are seen or unseen, whether they dwell far or near, whether they have come to be or will come to be, may all things be inwardly happy. No one should deceive another, nor despise anyone anywhere. Because of anger and thoughts of aversion, no one should wish suffering on another. Just as a mother would protect her son, her only son, with her own life, so one should develop towards all beings a state of mind without boundaries. And toward the whole world, one should develop loving kindness, a state of mind without boundaries, above, below and across, unconfined, without enmity, without adversaries. Whether standing, walking, sitting or lying down, as long as one is not drowsy, one should resolve on this mindfulness. They call this a divine dwelling here.
So this vision of unconditional love has very concrete consequences in terms of society. may all beings be happy, not just some of them. That means any solution needs to take into account the needs of all living beings. And that means it's a politics, whatever politics we have is not one of blind party loyalties. You know, we can't just do the bandas, the party loyalties. If my party wins and your party loses, that isn't in line with this principle. Why? Well, because it's for all beings, you know. But even more pragmatically, we can say, well, if my party wins now, the sense of injury to your party will cause a social instability. And therefore, in the long run, my party will suffer too. It just doesn't work. Hatred of one group dominating another won't work. So, in order to resolve these problems, we need deep levels of cooperation, deep levels of mutual awareness and cooperation. And it may sound a bit pie in the sky, but we've got examples all around us. I mean, if you look at the history of Catalonia during the Republic in the 30s, amazing levels of cooperation here. The production in the factories actually went up during the Republic. Of course, that was destroyed in the conflagration that Europe went through between communism and fascism. The Republic was destroyed, but we have amazing examples here of cooperation. So these things are possible. Okay, so principle number 1, unconditional love is the only way out. Principle number 2, we need a society that conforms to the law of karma, which I talked about just now. The social order has to reflect the fact that our actions have consequences concordant with their ethical quality. Skillful actions tend to happier consequences and individuals' growth. Unskillful actions tend to painful consequences and the blunting of your individuality. So in order to support that in society, there must be something that functions in this way, which, well, it's the function of the justice system. We need to encourage ethical actions and restrain or even punish unethical actions. Otherwise, the unethical actions will go on the rampage unchecked. And the society that doesn't check that, it slowly works towards its destruction. So that's a part of a Buddhist political agenda. We support a justice system based on universal loving kindness, not just conventional moralities. You have to look at what's the real benefit for the beings. But you need a society that enshrines that law in the universal law of karma, in its structure. And let's not be naive about the selfishness and power at work in the world. You know, it's rampant, and we've got, even now in the news every day, you've got men like Trump and Putin. These people will use their power to manipulate entire populations to serve their desires. That's what they're doing. And if we're not aware and emotionally intelligent, they will manipulate us. So you have to take responsibility for your not letting your buttons be pushed by the powerful and the selfish forces at work in the world. You know, through social media and other means, they can say something and get us all revved up. And there are people who manipulate us for their own selfish ends. And we mustn't let the society be based on that. So the third and last point of the Buddhist political agenda is that the light needs to shine forth without obstruction. It's essential that the quality of the luminous mind, the mind filled with clarity, compassion and freedom, can shine forth and warm the world without being diminished or blocked by cynical or selfish concerns. And friends, well, forgive me for putting it so crudely, but if we lose the influence of this light in our society, we're screwed, we're buggered. You know, it's like the forces will burn the world, external and internal. Those forces of greed, hatred, delusion, the destruction of the environment, so on, there'll be nothing to stop it. We must protect this light of clarity, kindness and freedom. So that's our job as Buddhists, I say, it's my job as a Buddhist. Or to say the same thing in other words, we have to create conducive conditions so that human beings can grow as individuals, so they can grow spiritually, and so some of them can even fully wake up and become Buddhas. That's our political agenda, and that's the contribution that Buddhists can make to the world's crisis. We have to enable the light to shine forth without obstruction so that human beings can grow, and we have to make the path and the tools for that available so that individuals can break free from hatred, craving and willful ignorance. And these days there are very few people willing to do this. We in the True Atma Buddhist community, that spark of light is present amongst us, and it's really precious. It's the most important thing in a certain kind of way. But it's also really impossible to put it into words. What is it really? Even to talk about it as light and the luminous mind, it's to some extent misrepresented. And this is the very paradox of spiritual life. You're committing yourself to something which is very real, very tangible, but you can never quite put it into words. And it's really important that some people protect and promote this light, because the traditional moral order has collapsed, yeah? I'm beginning to wind up the talk now. But I'll just touch on this briefly. For instance, the prestige of the Catholic Church, very powerful in Europe, but it's diminished because of centuries of absolute power and dogmatic beliefs. It's diminished. And other religious communities shut themselves up in fundamentalism. You know, the attack of materialism upon them, they've just become very rigid and fundamentalist. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't grow anyway. The arts can be a vehicle to communicate the light, this spirit, this spark, but they become so saturated with political theory and commercial values. You know, it's very hard to find arts that are animated by the light. I'm from England, you know, and we've got a wonderful liberal humanistic culture in the UK, but it's become very insipid, you know, lacking a clear vision of what it is to be a human being, what we can become. The Anglican liberal values, you know, they're not bad, they're just nice and a bit dead, you know. And then, of course, as I've pointed out, there's materialism, capitalism, consumerism, gobbling up everything greedily so as to maximise profits for unscrupulous individuals and organisations, vehicles for craving, greed, and so on. That's what's going on, and there are many people sort of singing for the light and promoting the light. However, do not despair. We're not the only ones in this small Buddhist centre. We're not the only ones who value and protect the sparks of light. Other groups and communities are animated by the light and express it in their own ways, many, many ways. You know, we've got the whole movements of social change, ecological activism. Many people there dedicate themselves selflessly, animated by the light in their own way. And there are tolerant and ecumenical spiritual communities in all traditions, you know, not just the Buddhist tradition. In the arts, in their sublime mode, they inspire us and move us to transcendence. You know, the arts can be a vehicle for this. And then, well, there's paganism and things loosely called the New Age. Some of those movements, you can see that there's a light, a spark of that luminous mind manifesting. And then I continue to read about science and philosophy and so on. I can see that there are changes happening in the discourse, in new movements in philosophy and science, neuroscience, as well as, of course, the great thinkers like Carl Jung and so on. You know, there's light in many places, and so we're part of a wave of rediscovery of the lights, of the sacred, a renewal of that, a renewal of the transcendent in the 21st century. You know, the old discourses are really in decline, but there are people trying to express this in new ways, and it's important that we recognise that and participate with that, and to the extent that we can see as Buddhists that, you know, a particular community or group expresses the light in accordance with principles of Dharma, in accordance with generosity and ethics, well, we support it and connect, and that's a very healing thing to do. And as Buddhists, we can offer a very clear vision of the light, what it essentially is, what we essentially are, and very tried and tested tools for the transformation of self and world. That's our particular gift. And, well, what a different world it would be if these values manifested more and more broadly. Okay, so that's really what I want to say. I'm going to summarise it because there were lots of twists and turns there, and then we're going to end with a poem by Mary Oliver, which Sadishri showed me, which I think it expresses something of the light and what it is to be an individual. But I'll just summarise briefly what I've said. So the world's burning. Yeah, the world's burning, and it's worse than in the Buddha's day, for all the reasons we saw. And it's not going to work just to focus on social change or just to focus on personal change. You have to have the two wings so that the movements of change can fly and transform self and world. And in order to do this, we have to look fundamentally and revise the story we tell ourselves about who we are. I would say the materialist story is bankrupt now. It's not helping anybody, it's not helping the world. The Buddhist story is that we're fundamentally luminous mind. Yeah? If we eliminate the veils, the adventitious defilements, there's a luminous mind. To do that, we have to become individuals, and we have to realise our actions have consequences and act according to that, take responsibility for them, and develop generosity and our ethics. And the Buddhist political agenda is that the basis for social change has to be unconditional love. Anything else isn't going to work. We want a society that conforms to the law of karma, and we want conditions that allow the light of clarity, wherever it manifests, in whoever it manifests, clarity, kindness and freedom to shine forth without obstruction. That's what we strive for, that's our contribution. And we're not alone. Many groups and people are trying to do this, and we should cooperate with them. So, let's finish with Mary Oliver, the journey.
One day, you finally knew what you had to do, and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. "Mend my life," each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But, little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to shine through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognised as your own. That kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life that you could save.